moving over to video number 2. So I'm carrying on talking about the overlap between Asperger's syndrome and non-verbal learning disability, which can get quite confusing. And indeed, the overlap between the two has not really been resolved, and it is quite ambiguous, and different researchers and scientists will say different things. Some people say that Asperger's syndrome is a very severe form of non-verbal learning disability. Some people will say that Asperger's syndrome is one particular type of non-verbal learning disability, or a particular subtype which is quite severe, but that there are differences between Asperger's syndrome and non-verbal learning disabilities originally conceptualised by Byron Walk, in that not every person with Asperger's has the visual spatial deficits or problems with maths and all of those other learning challenges outlined by Walk, which is very specific, but there is a great deal of overlap between the two. Some people say that non-verbal learning disability, at least its more narrower formulation as defined by Byron Walk, which includes the challenges in maths and visual spatial skills, is a very specific learning disability which does or does not occur with Asperger's depending on the person. So that, in other words, it could be a particular learning profile which can occur with Asperger's but doesn't have to. Although every single person with Asperger's will, by definition, have some non-verbal learning challenges, because that is kind of the definition of the social problems found in Asperger's syndrome. But in a way, Asperger's syndrome, the non-verbal challenges are more specific to the social side, and they sometimes, but not always, also occur with more wider non-verbal difficulties in visual spatial skills and maths. So in other words, to put that again, every single person with Asperger's will have some non-verbal learning challenges by definition, because that's what Asperger's essentially is: difficulties with non-verbal communication, difficulties with non-verbal social processing. But not all people with Asperger's will have additional non-verbal difficulties in executive functioning, organisation and visual spatial skills, which is part of the Walk definition of non-verbal learning disability more widely, if you like. And it's also possible to have non-verbal learning disability in its more milder form and not to have Asperger's syndrome, or to just have non-verbal difficulties in visual spatial skills without any social problems at all. So there seems to be a very wide spectrum or continuum of non-verbal learning disabilities, some more severe than others, and depending on the individual you can have any combination. For me, obviously, I've got a particularly severe form of non-verbal learning disabilities originally defined by Walk, with a really high verbal, really low performance, and all those executive challenges of visual spatial problems, plus the Asperger's syndrome, because I also have very severe social interaction problems. But yes, it is quite confusing, all of this. So to carry on then, in this article it explains, this is the article by Dorothy Thacker from November 2001, Confronting a Puzzle on Non-Verbal Learning Disabilities. She says that to help ease anxiety, the student becomes dependent on predictable routines. They often become attached to rituals and resist changing them. However, unlike in OCD, they need these rituals and routines, because without them life is too frightening and unpredictable. So in OCD, the person tends to kind of resist the impulses a bit, and they also see them as ego-dystonic, which can make them unhappy and depressed because the anxiety is seen as alien to them, whereas in non-verbal learning disabilities, the rituals and routines and obsessive, compulsive behaviour is more ego-syntonic and is essential for the person's well-being, and it's almost like they need this because without it life is too frightening and unpredictable. And yeah, that's very true to me, although I also do have OCD alongside of my Asperger's NVLD. I sort of see it as different to the type of OCD that people without these conditions have. There is some overlap, but it is a lot of it is very kind of logical and connected to my need for routine and resistance to change as well. So yeah. NVLD, by the way, is described as a white matter, white hemisphere deficit, Byron Walk, as indeed Asperger's is also described as a white hemisphere deficit. This may be profound or mild, so obviously there are different characteristics in each person depending on the extent of the deficit. There are very specific strengths in NVLD as well, and also in Asperger's syndrome too. For example, advanced store of factual information, strong literacy skills is common, and excellent phonemic awareness. Obviously this isn't always the case in Asperger's, but it is always the case in the broader NVLD as defined by Byron Walk. So in prototypical NVLD, which is NVLD in its very kind of narrow formulation, describing a very particular learning skill with or without social challenges, there's always going to be this excellent phonemic awareness and very strong literacy skills. That's kind of part of the original formulation, which I happen to meet. Like I said, it's kind of like the opposite to dyslexia in terms of its strengths and challenges. But obviously, although every single person with Asperger's syndrome will have some non-verbal social challenges by definition, not all of them will have the wider kind of strengths and challenges within a learning domain. So, particularly if an Aspergic person also has dyslexia, for example, then they won't by definition meet the original walk definition of NVLD, even though they'll share the social features. That makes sense. But there are going to be difficulties with organisation. And then with oral organisation and organisation more widely. And then it goes on, it lists a case study here. There's a case study. For example, Chris, a person in a case study, could read before she started school. Her verbal IQ was 120, but her non-verbal or performance was 102. So in this case, the person is basically very bright all round. Their performance and their verbal IQ and their performance IQ is pretty high. Just to compare that, in my case, my verbal IQ as an adult is 140, but my performance IQ is only 66. So I have a way bigger discrepancy than this person. So obviously my NVLD is obviously more severe. And indeed, and as a child, my performance was only around in the 50s region, and my verbal was just over 100. Whereas this person, both her verbal and performance are above average, but or at least average, but her verbal is significantly above average, whereas her performance is, about average, really. And this person indeed did end up with help from school and other sources actually overcoming quite a lot of her difficulties, but it makes clear that this is because essentially she was a fairly mild case. So obviously the more severe your NVLD, the harder it's going to be to compensate. It didn't say whether this person also had Asperger's or not, which obviously would add to the problems. But she does seem to be quite a typical case of a milder NVLD. So for example, maths confused her. She had problems with maths. She got lost a lot. That's common. She had difficulties with the subtleties of language, difficulty staying organised. It says here that the students with the milder forms of NVLD may not be noticed at all. So their anxiety, their preference to play alone or only with one other person, or one other student may be mistaken for a normal variation in personality. Obviously in my case, my NVLD was severe enough for it to come to the concern of teachers from a young age, although it wasn't labelled NVLD, because obviously that's kind of a sort of like an American description for these problems. I don't think it's really much well known in the UK, but obviously, all of the symptoms were there, and it basically described it, essentially, used the language, my verbal skills very high, and severe difficulties in performance, and non-verbal visual spatial skills, and so on. So mine was pretty severe, and as such was noticed from a young age, but obviously in those milder forms, it might potentially fly under the radar. I do wonder, by the way, this is just a hypothesis, but I do wonder whether some very, very, very mild cases of NVLD who maybe aren't actually autistic are now getting diagnosed as autistic. I know it's a bit controversial to say that, but with the broadening out of the autism spectrum, I do wonder whether some of the people who are really successful might actually just have an extremely mild form of NVLD and aren't actually autistic, because there's a lot of overlap between the two, but obviously in Asperger's, as traditionally defined, the social problems are going to be very severe. But nowadays, lots of pretty mild people are being diagnosed. You might actually just have NVLD in a milder form. Or maybe not like severe NVLD, but like a really mild form. I don't know, it's just a thought. So then there's another article here called Non-Verbal Learning Disability, Asperger, Pervasive Development Disorder, Should We Care? And this article is by Roger A. Brunswick, etc. And he calls AS a severe form of NVLD, which is interesting. And like I said, there are campaigns to get NVLD as a standalone diagnosis into the DSM. I think that's a good idea, particularly for those people who aren't actually autistic but still have some challenges. Because I do feel people should be diagnosed appropriately and given the right support, and also it would help everyone because you can do more. It will help with research and everything. So I think it'd be quite good if those people with milder challenges but who still need support can get given a diagnosis like NVLD. I think that would be good. And then there's another article called AS and NVLD, Descriptions, Differences and Similarities by Yvonne Fast. She says the milder ones can be very successful and they might go undiagnosed. In many cases, however, adults of several degrees are unable to find to keep work that matches their strengths. And the reason is the disparity between high verbal and relatively lower performance IQ in the score of those, and relatively lower performance IQ scores in those people with NVLD and Asperger's syndrome. Performance IQ points to the ability to achieve successfully at work. That's interesting. As I say, mine's only 66, so yeah, I'm buggered all round. Yeah, despite my university degree, Yeah, so it says, like I was saying, basically it's common for them to have several degrees yet are unable to find keep work because, basically, if you have a really low performance IQ, you're basically screwed. That's basically what that's saying. Obviously my problems are compounded by the fact I also have OCD, by the way, which obviously makes my disability more severe than maybe it would be if I didn't have OCD, although a lot of that is linked to my fear of change as well. Because performance IQ points to the ability to achieve successfully at work. So no matter how well you can succeed potentially with degrees at university or college because of your high verbal IQ, if you can't execute and basically do practical stuff and follow instructions and stuff in a fast-paced environment among other people, you're basically screwed. Because that's what performance measures, your ability to perform, essentially. It's arguably, possibly even more important than verbal IQ in a weird way when it comes to working. Just 12% of people with Asperger's are in full-time employment. You wouldn't know that these days, though. And only 3% actually live independently. So again, that shows that the ones we hear about in the media is the creme de la creme, and they don't represent most people. Although you can be forgiven for thinking it's the norm for people with Asperger's to have kids, relationships, and taboo, because that's what we tend to hear about these days. But actually, that's the creme de la creme. That's the exception to the rule. Some of them might actually just have very mild NVLD and not actually even be autistic, possibly. So it's hard to know because they got rid of Asperger's. Well, don't we do? We're not even going to know now, are we? But yeah, it talks here about the difficulties understanding God, my foot I just banged my foot. So I just banged my foot. I hate when it happens. Difficulty understanding idiomatic expression